Libby's going to talk for about 40 minutes on her keynote topic, which is Capitalism and Conservation in the Age of Security, the Vitalization of the State. And Libby is in the Department of Geography, but she's also a member of the Centre for Refugee Studies, and she also is very heavily involved in refugee education. She works on green militarisation and displacement, and I have to say, I think she's probably one of the most cited authors in this conference. I've sat through lots of panels where it's been Lunstrum 2015, Lunstrum 2016, so that's been brilliant to see as well. And then after Libby has spoken, our discussant is Scott Prudham from the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, and many of you will know his work. He's the author of Knock on Wood and also the co-editor of Neoliberal Environments, and I think it's fair to say, or fair to describe him as one of the kind of leading voices in political ecology. So Scott will talk for about 10 minutes after Libby, but I'll hand over to you now, Libby, for a very interesting keynote. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd just like to begin by giving a word of thanks to the conference organizers, both for inviting me, but also for what has turned out to be just a fantastic conference. And I also want to thank all of you because I hope that you'll see your work reflected in what I'm talking about today. In the initial version of this talk, I ran through it and I had to cut it down by like 20 minutes. And so I had to end up, one of the things I had to cut was like, so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that to get it down. But you are all, like all the ideas of many of you in the room are reflected in here. I hope that you do see that in the sort of the conversation that we're having today. So sincere thanks to everyone here. So let me start by setting the scene. Two scenes, actually. The first takes us to South Africa's iconic Kruger National Park. On a recent trip to Kruger, I lay awake one moonlit night with sleep interrupted by the heavy sounds of helicopters ahead. The intensity of their presence mirrored that of their mission: to find those responsible for the killing of a rhino for its horn. So the cries of wildlife, which typically fill the nocturnal soundscape of Kruger, had been drowned out by the deep hum of aerial engines and the intense chopping of their blades. Kruger has long used aircraft to patrol the park and for game counts, but these aircraft have been recently joined by new additions to the fleet, additions that look like this. These are helicopters that have been donated by defense corporations to assist with rhino poaching efforts. And these defense corporations have also donated drones, military training for rangers, and sniffer dogs as well. So we're seeing sort of the rise of military corporations within the realm of conservation. Second scene. Let's move north towards the border with Botswana. If we go to the border with Botswana in South Africa, we see a new anti-poaching mechanism put in place. Serenaded by the hums of heavily guarded convoys, rhinos are being translocated from South Africa to Botswana. And as rhinos enter the country, they become the property and ward of the Botswana state. And once in Botswana, rhinos are defended by rangers that are members of the Botswana Defense Force, so they're members of the national military. And these rangers are authorized to institute the country's controversial shoot-on-sight policy. But other actors assist behind the scenes. And what I have in mind here is that rhino relocation is extraordinarily expensive. And so luxury tourism companies have been organizing private donations from very wealthy donors who are often offered high-end safari packages as a sign of thanks for their donations to fund rhino relocation. Well, these donations enable militarization, not by providing military hardware and services the way that military corporations do, but rather these private donations provide the object that militarization is to protect. They provide the rhino. And this reinforces the rationale for the rhino's protection. So what do these cases have in common? These are pretty dispersed cases, disparate cases. What happens when we draw them together? What I want to draw your attention to is that they both, in some sense, embody the same encounter. This encounter between conservation, capitalism, the state, and security. This sort of dovetailing of these four factors. And what we've seen recently in the last few years is this intensification of this link between security on the one hand, conservation on the other hand. And as many people have pointed out, conservation has long had a militarized past. But what we've been seeing in the last 5 years or so is this intensification of this relationship between conservation and security. And so this brings us to just a bit of vocabulary. I won't dwell on this. But when I talk about securitized conservation, what I'm talking about is this recent trend of taking environmental challenges, treating them as if they are security problems, and then responding to them accordingly as security problems. In extreme cases of securitized conservation, we enter the realm of green militarization, of militarized conservation. And what I mean by this is using military actors, techniques, technologies, logics, and so forth in the pursuit of conservation. And again, we've seen a really severe intensification of this in the last few years. One of the things that I point out in the paper, but I actually don't have a lot of time to discuss today, but I do want to draw your attention to it, is that I see this linking of conservation and security as part of a much broader securitization of non-traditional areas of life. So we can think about the securitization of migration and refugees, borders, urban centers, police forces, livelihoods, healthcare when we look at the Ebola crisis and so forth. And so just to sort of invite you to think about that conservation in some sense isn't special. It fits within this broader securitization that we see kind of surrounding us, sort of at both local and global scales. So that's the encounter. Now the invitation. The invitation here is to get us all to start thinking more about this relationship between conservation and security. I think this is a concern right now, but my sense is this is only the tip of the iceberg, that we are going to see this explosion of this linking of conservation and security over the next few years, and I think we need to be prepared to confront it. And so the invitation here is to use the paper, hopefully to generate a larger conversation around this conversation that a number of us have already been sort of intimately involved in, and to bring the state and capitalism into the picture as well. The offering. This is my more specific offering to you. And what I want to show today is that, really the argument here, is that profit-seeking corporations and private capital play a central role in enabling green militarization. This is where I think capitalism comes in, is that it enables forms of green militarization, enables its expansion. And more than this, capitalism in these forms vitalizes state power. I want to go back to the state. I really want to foreground the state here. So that's the kind of layout of what I'm going to be looking at today. I am going to focus on these two case studies, but I hope that the talk isn't so case study specific that we lose sight of this broader patterns of this coupling, especially of conservation and security. So the case studies aren't designed to show you what's interesting about them in themselves, but use them as sort of this window into understanding broader trends around conservation and security and how those look at. Okay, so before I get to the case studies, just a very quick background on rhino poaching in South Africa. Since 2008, South Africa has seen a very rapid increase in commercial poaching in rhinos, and we see this, I think, pretty clearly in the graph here. And this is tied in part to the demand for rhino horn, primarily in Asia, in China and Vietnam, but there's also markets in North America, also markets in Europe. And rhino horn, on some estimates, it reaches $65,000 a kilo. So we're talking about an extraordinarily expensive commodity here, one for which there is growing demand. Ground zero for rhino poaching is South Africa and Kruger National Park in particular, that you see in the western side of this map here. And this is merely because of the fact that South Africa and Kruger in particular have the world's most concentrated sites of rhino in the world. So that explains why there's been so much rhino poaching in South Africa and Kruger. So South Africa has actually done quite a lot to respond to rhino poaching. It has a pretty sophisticated response, but if we look at what's happening within Kruger, this response is primarily a militarized response. And so this includes things like bringing in the national military into the park, who hasn't been in the park for a number of years, bringing them back in, bringing in retired military officials who made names for themselves under the apartheid regime, bringing them in to head up a lot of the militarized conservation efforts, bringing in military technologies and military logics. And so what we're seeing is that this is a case of outright green militarization. Kruger has become an intensely militarized space in the last few years. This is something that a number of us have written on, and it's been a really kind of key theme in the literature on militarization and conservation. So where does capitalism fit into this? If we look at the procurement of rhino horn and its movement around the world, at every stage in this commodity chain, this is about capitalism. It's about profit maximization and the accumulation of profit. If we're looking at, again, the procurement and the movement of rhino horn, but I'm interested more in the response to rhino poaching. Where might capitalism fit into the response to rhino poaching? And one thing I've noticed, and looking through the literature and talking to people, is that state rhino protection is not centrally motivated by capitalist logic. We do see a little bit of this here and there, that we have to protect the rhino because it's good for ecotourism and this brings in money. But these arguments are actually pretty tiny when we look at the rationales for rhino protection. By and large, the rationales have a lot more to do with the ecological protection of rhino for its own sake, the protection of the species, and very much so, the logics are about, they're nationalist logics around the protection of the nation state, and that you need to fight rhino poaching because it's an attack on national sovereignty, it's an attack on national territory, and it's also an attack on the rhino as the embodiment of the nation's heritage. And so these are the primary rationales that we're seeing behind the state's attempt to save the rhino or to protect the rhino. And so I was trying to think a bit more about, like, okay, well, if capitalism doesn't kind of squarely come in at this level, where does it come in? And I think where it comes in very clearly is in the way that rhino protection is increasingly shaped and enabled by partnerships with for-profit firms or private donors. So capitalism comes in the sense of what is shaping and what is enabling rhino protection, not as sort of centrally in terms of what is motivating rhino protection from the outskirts. Okay, so let's get into these case studies that I think are actually quite telling for what light they can shine on this relationship between conservation, security, and capitalism. I'm going to get to the state kind of after I run through the case studies, and I hope it makes sense why the talk is structured in that way when I get to that point. Okay, so defense corporations. Hovering above the lush South African bush is a sleek, insect-like helicopter, its camel-clad exterior nodding to its role in defending this vast landscape. Proudly displayed on its side is the logo of the Ishikevitz Family Foundation's anti-poaching program, a human hand with an outline of Africa forming the palm. With an inspirational musical score substituting in for its telltale sound, the chopper veers quickly away, demonstrating its equal speed and agility. Welcome to the promotional video, Ishikevitz Family Foundation Fights Rhino Poaching. I want to show you a short excerpt from the video. I shortened it down so it's only about 2.5 minutes long, because I want to give you a feel for the way not only that the Family Foundation is supporting rhino poaching, but how they're selling this. And just ask you to pay attention to the language of heritage, the language of war, and really their argument for the need for military support for rhino protection. And then I'll go back and we'll talk a bit more about what's going on here. Okay.
Poaching in Africa has become an epidemic. It's become a problem that is now starting to affect the viability of our natural resources into the future. Our support for sandparks is because of the work that they're already doing, because of the remarkable achievements they're already making, and because of the fact that if we're going to fight a war, we have to fight this as a war. You can't take sticks to a gunfight.
The aim really is to strengthen our fight against rhino poaching by bringing in solutions that we don't have in-house.
We're giving this equipment to sandparks so that they can use it now when they need it and not have to wait multiple budget periods so that they can get it through normal government channels. It's ideal for visible policing. It carries a pilot and a spotter, and quite frankly the range is limited by the size of the pilot's bladder.
The
Jacobit's Family Foundation is quite fortunate because we have the power and the strength of the Paramount Group behind us. And today we are very proud to be able to hand over the Gazelle military tactical helicopter to Sandbox. This helicopter is going to up the ante considerably, and we believe has the potential to be the tipping point in this war. David, I'd like to invite you up so that I can officially hand you your new toy. We need to get all Africans behind this initiative. Now, the same way as the Jacobit's Family Foundation, in partnership with Paramount, are using our resources, we need other companies, other NGOs to join us, to come on board, to look deep at what they can provide, what capability they can provide, what resources they can provide, and join this fight, join this war. No one of us can do this on our own.
Despite the gentle ring of the term family, the Ecology Family Foundation is actually the charitable arm of the Paramount Group. The Paramount Group is Africa's largest privately owned aerospace and defense corporation. So here we're talking about a military firm, the largest privately owned by the Ecology Family military and defense corporation on the continent. So, in addition to this, the Gazelle military and tactical helicopter, the Ecology Family Foundation, through this charitable organization, part of the Paramount Group, they've also offered Sandparks' Kruger's parent organization. They've offered Sandparks a high-tech Seeker Seabird, which is a surveillance plane, as well as tracker dogs and advanced paramilitary training for rangers. And here I'm talking about at the country level, not just what's going on within Kruger. Well, these aren't isolated contributions. They're part of a, quote, ongoing capacity-building partnership with Sandparks and Paramount to address the wildlife trade. And this reflects a much broader growth in public-private partnerships that Sandparks has with the private sector. What's different about this one is that it's with an aerospace and defense corporation. So Paramount's engagement with anti-poaching actually extends beyond its direct support for the state. And a very important example is this guy. I would like you to meet Parabot. Parabot is a 9.7 meter high, 1-ton superhero built from the Bombay 6. The Bombay 6 is Paramount's largest armored vehicle. It's its largest tank. I want to watch a short video. It's only 30 seconds. It's a CGI video that Paramount produced that shows us the genesis of Parabot from this tank. Is Parabot. As I told Rebecca and some of my graduate students, you honestly can't make this shit up. Like, it's too crazy, even for academics to come up with. Okay, so what might you ask does Parabot have to do with rhino poaching? Well, this Rhino Man cyborg is celebrated by Paramount as, quote, Africa's largest superhero, who is on a mission to protect our rhino. He is, quote, a symbol of resistance and a message to the criminal gangs who are behind the slaughter of our rhino that we will not give up on Africa's wildlife heritage. Heritage again. He's also a reminder of the defense industry's, quote, unique position to strengthen conservation efforts. Keep Parabot in mind, because we're going to come back to him. He's actually an important part of this story that I'm trying to tell here. Okay, and I do realize there's the danger of everything else being boring in what I'm going to say, because it follows Parabot, so please just bear with me. I do need to talk briefly about Denel. Denel is another aerospace and defense corporation that's provided Sandparks with military support, including drones and also dogs. What's really interesting about Denel, though, is that Denel is state-owned. It's a state-owned defense corporation, but it's for profit. It's a profit-generating business. It's a business for which the South African government is the sole shareholder. So we're not talking about a private corporation here, but we're still talking about a for-profit corporation. And so when we take Denel and Paramount together, what we're seeing is this growth in for-profit defense corporations who have entered into the realm of conservation to assist with these anti-poaching efforts. And this might seem obvious, but I think we need to reflect on what these firms gain out of these relationships. And this begins with the fact that, and this is why I want to think kind of more broadly beyond these cases, that anti-poaching and fighting wildlife crime provides a new market for the goods and services of military and defense firms, and a really quickly growing market as we see the suturing of conservation and security grow. This is a really lucrative market, and again, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg here, what we're seeing. And in fact, groups, especially like Paramount, they're actually good at not only tapping into this market, but I think really creating the need for this market by using this language of war and this language of wildlife being attacked as the nation's heritage. They're really creating the market. They're not passively just tapping into it, but expanding that market. Clearly these firms benefit because they sell their goods at a profit. What's interesting at this point, though, is most of these goods are actually donated. They're actually not, at this point, they're not being sold at a profit. Some are, but most are donated. But I think this is really important because it sets the stage for future contracts. Like, these firms are smart. They know that there's a growth in this area. They set out to give the goods and services as a donation, and this is actually good for their bottom line kind of down the road. But also, donations are important because of the really shady reputation of the defense industry globally and within South Africa. This becomes a form of corporate social responsibility, a way for them to advertise, hey, look, we're not that bad, we love Rhino, we're going to do our part to protect Rhino. And so, sort of on that symbolic level, these become really important relationships as well. So Parabot, which I promised I'd return to, is really important here as well, because it's an example of the way in which defense corporations are exploiting rhino poaching to advertise their products. And I say this because Parabot is on display at consumer trade shows, and he's also on display at aerospace and defense shows, both within South Africa and internationally. He was just recently on display at a defense exhibition in Jordan. And it's sort of like, come to our tent, see Parabot, and then see all the other goods and services that we have to sell. So sort of tapping in to rhino poaching to expand markets, not within conservation, but within this kind of broader political economy of the defense industry. Okay, case number 2. Sorry, that got off a little bit there. Let's go and look at a different example that gives us sort of different insight into this relationship between conservation and security, this issue of rhino relocation. And to appreciate rhino relocation's aims and gravity, I want to go to the upscale American lifestyle magazine, Town and Country. This is the cover image from a cover story. This is from last October 2015. The image for the cover story, provocatively entitled, Uma Thurman's Journey to Protect Africa's Wildlife from Vicious Poachers. Okay, a bit loaded. The article, I think the title and the image give us some insight into what's going on in this article. And it's really an article that is essentially an advertisement. It recounts Uma Thurman's journey to go collect rhinos in South Africa, follow them into Botswana where they're released. But it's an advertisement because it's paired with another article that comes in the next edition that invites readers to become part of this mission to move rhinos from South Africa to Botswana. But this is not an experience for those of us with meager means. Like, I doubt that many of us in the room could actually partake in this because it's extraordinarily expensive. This is organized by an elite safari company called Explore Inc. And if you would like to participate in this translocation, it will set you back over $18,000 a person. Flights not included. They're very clear about that. Flights not included. And there's a tax-deductible donation requirement of $50,000 per couple, and the $50,000 goes to fund the translocation of the rhino from South Africa. As a sign of thanks, tourists are able to witness the rhino relocation, and if the stars align, they might be able to actually participate in it, to help out with it. So we're seeing the rise of these lucrative philanthrotourism and potential voluntourism opportunities emerge out of this rhino relocation project. Another similar project is one called Rhinos Without Borders, similarly organized by a luxury tourism outfitter. They are more ambitious, trying to raise $8 million through a combination of crowd funding, but more importantly, they're soliciting large donations. And if you can cough up between $250,000 and $1 million to give to this project, you will be given a 9-day safari for 2. So again, these sort of like high-end safaris as signs of thanks for these mega donations. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about what's going on with capitalism here, because I think this speaks to this broader trend. These projects fit in a much broader pattern that we're seeing around rhino poaching, where rhino protection is generating a cottage industry of new organizations and new projects that are designed to protect the rhino that depend on donations. And so we're seeing this sort of solicitation of money and the need to have money to run these programs. We see a lot of new programs, and then we also see existing conservation organizations asking for money for rhino poaching as well. And we're also seeing mega donations with money going directly to the state. The best example here is that of Howard Buffett, who is Warren Buffett's son, who recently gave almost $24 million to South Africa for rhino protection. The reason this is about security and about militarization is a lot of this money that's being solicited through donations is going directly toward militarized conservation. Not just conservation, but militarized conservation. So this really is about private funding of militarized conservation. So I want to show you what this looks like in the rhino relocation project. And the reason I want to look at rhino relocation is it's actually a much more subtle example of the ways in which private donations are funding militarized conservation. I think we could look at Howard Buffett's donation. It would be a pretty explicit example of that, because a lot of that money is going to militarized conservation. But what's interesting about this is its subtlety. And I think it's the subtlety that we need to pay attention to as we start to see capitalism and security hook up in kind of ever more interesting and problematic ways. Okay, so the subtlety begins with the moral ambivalence of the project. This is actually a great project, I think, from an ecological perspective. It will help rehabilitate Botswana's rhino populations, help rehabilitate the rhino range in Botswana, and it's fantastic for the gene pool of rhinos, because you're bringing rhinos from different parts of the continent into Botswana, and it helps with the genetic diversity of an animal that has very little genetic diversity at this point. So very good, I think, from an ecological perspective. The problem is that this is a militarized project, and it's sort of unashamedly militarized. Some of the core rationales for this project is that the reason we should bring rhinos into Botswana is because their rangers are members of the BDF, Botswana Defense Force, and because of Botswana's infamous shoot-on-sight policy. And I want to read you a quote. This is actually from one of the Town and Country articles that I mentioned earlier here. And this is a quote from the Botswana Minister of Environment, Wildlife and Tourism, T.K. Kama, who's also the president's brother. So he says in this article, "We do get criticized occasionally for our poaching stance. Armed men will be shot if they do not surrender their arms immediately on request. But that message travels very well. I have a saying that keeps me motivated. God will judge the poacher. It is up to us to arrange the meeting." And in fact, this last quote about God will judge the poacher, it is up to us to arrange the meeting, has become his mantra on poaching. Bram knows this very well. Like, he repeats this over and over again. It's sort of this tagline on poaching. And so there's this project is morally ambivalent, and this is, I think, kind of foresight into what we're going to see. We're going to see the rise of these projects that are really good in some sense, and we want to be behind them, but they're really problematic in the sense that militarized conservation is sort of seeped into them in these ways. I think this is also an interesting way in which remilitarization can be outsourced. And what I mean by this is that South Africa does not have a shoot-on-sight policy on the explicit ground that it violates the Constitution. Those of us working in South Africa know that there actually is a shoot-on-sight policy in practice. But in terms of the Constitution, you cannot have a shoot-on-sight policy. So when South Africa sends its rhinos, or allows its rhinos to be sent to Botswana, this outsources remilitarization. It allows Botswana to do that. And this is a move that's enabled by private capital. So again, sort of an invitation to start thinking about the spatial relations around militarized conservation. I think this isn't the last kind of form of outsourcing of remilitarization we're going to see. And we already see it in private reserves, just kind of private military forces taking over these sort of militarized roles as well. I also think this is a great example of the indirect support of remilitarization. So if we look at the private military, or not the private military firms, but just the military firms in general, they're offering direct support of remilitarization through, tactical helicopters and things like that. But in this case, this is indirect support because when a wealthy benefactor goes to fund rhino relocation, they're not funding shoot on site. That's the Botswana government. They're funding shoot on site. The benefactor is funding rhino relocation, but this does become an indirect support for green militarization. So again, I think looking at these patterns, these sort of new patterns around the relationship between conservation and securitization. Okay, not at last, but we're going to finally enter the state here. And this is kind of where I want to make my argument. So what we can draw from these cases of rhino relocation and the provision of military goods and services for military corporations is that capitalism in these forms vitalizes the state. And what I mean by this is that capitalism in these forms helps the state consolidate control over territory and resources. So this is about territorialization. So let's just pull this apart. And if we look at the goods and provisions and services from the military firms, what we're seeing, for example, is that aircraft enables the high-tech surveillance of a national park, very immense landscapes. And once poaching activity is spotted by this aircraft and by dogs, by tracker dogs, tactical helicopters are able to arrive very quickly. They have rapid response. And then, at that point, increasingly well-trained rangers, often trained, given additional training by these military corporations, that they can quickly arrive to quote-unquote neutralize poachers. And this reflects Sam Park's euphemism for arresting or killing poachers, neutralizing them. So in short, these goods and services strengthen state capacity to deter, apprehend, and ultimately to take out suspected poachers. So this is sort of the state consolidating power over this space. Well, what's going on with the privately funded rhino relocation? This is a bit more complicated, but I think this is still an example of the vitalization of state power. And what I mean by this is that these privately funded rhino relocation projects, they give the Botswana state more reason to engage in militarized practice because they have more rhino. They're given the object of militarization here. In other words, they give the state more license, the rhino relocation of the private nations, that is, it gives the state more license to set up this proverbial meeting between the poacher and God. So more rhinos translates into more justification for state engagement, state militarized capacity, and ultimately state violence here. Okay, so what we're seeing here, I think, is that private actors and for-profit actors, they do enable forms of militarized conservation, but not in a way that diminishes or merely reworks state power. And this is kind of the hallmark of the neoliberal conservation literature and how it tends to treat the state. We're seeing something very different here. What we're seeing is that capitalism in these forms better positions state authorities, here in the form of national armies and conservation authorities, to maintain and deploy their monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Granted, this is a very complex monopoly, but I think nonetheless it is a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And so this would include things like state-instituted killings of perceived environmental transgressors. We also have to think about the way here in which the relationship between the state and capital is quite complicated. They are not discrete entities, but nor are they the same thing. And I think this is actually one of the areas in the paper that I need to work through at a deeper level, is what exactly is the relationship between state and capital here. I gave a few examples of kind of the fuzzy boundary between the two, but I think returning to sort of some theory might help us speak more clearly about this relationship between the state and capital in cases like this. And I also want to point out here that what we're seeing here, it's not just that states are becoming stronger, but that states are actually being built through these practices. These are examples of militarized state formation. The The state isn't an entity that kind of pre-exists these practices. The state is built through these practices. And in this sense, I think we would be very wise to go back to the debates in the 1990s around conservation and state formation, around natural resource management and state formation. I think we can learn a lot by kind of looking at that. The debates that are still around, but I think to some extent they've been sort of eclipsed by some of the debates, very rich and important debates in animal conservation. Okay, you probably already guessed this, but I'm not a big fan of this linking of conservation and security, conservation and militarization. So I want to point out a few things that I think are really problematic. I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but hopefully give you a taste of some of the things we should be concerned about. First of all, economic sustainability. The types of rhino protection that we've looked at today are very expensive. And one of the problems here is that donors lose interest, and what happens when your donors lose interest and you don't have the support, and you've kind of set up on this militarized path. I think this can lead us in a really dangerous position, and there's likely more sustainable options here. Sustainables, including things like better community engagement that don't depend on sort of big, huge donor funding. Militarized conservation leads to grotesque human rights violations. Shoot on sight is probably the best example of this, and it also leads to deadly responses. So in South Africa in the last 5 years, Sandparks won't give me a precise number here, but to the best of our knowledge, several hundred suspected poachers have been shot and killed in South Africa. Some estimates go upwards to 500. I really can't give you a precise number, but we're talking in the hundreds here. In Botswana, that number is in the dozens of suspected poachers shot and killed in the last few years, so quite deadly. If you're not swayed by the human rights violations critique here, green militarization has very questionable conservation outcomes. And this is for two reasons. First of all, neutralizing a poacher does nothing to solve the problem because there's a bunch of other people waiting to come in and take his place. And also, a lot of the people who are being killed are people who are from the communities surrounding the parks. And we know that to have good, long-term, sustainable conservation, you have to have good relationships with communities. And the worst thing you can do on this front is kill people who are members of those communities, because those people are someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother, someone's uncle. And so we're seeing a severe deterioration in the relationship between peoples and parks around Kruger because of this. And the park administration knows this. It's not like some big secret that I'm uncovering here. I mean, this is a really severe problem that the park authorities are trying to work through right now. Another thing we need to be really wary about here is this is not just an invigorated state that we're seeing in both cases, but I think the rise of a much more deadly state. And if we take seriously the ways that states are strengthened in these cases, we can see how states are able to unleash much more stately power and violence. And that the state being formed as a militarized one, and I think quite a deadly one that we need to take seriously here. I also think the case draws attention to the dangers of linking environment, capitalism, patriotism, and nationalism. And what I have in mind here is that especially if we look at the military corporations involved here, that they're motivated by a sense of patriotism and nationalism, and I really do believe this is genuine. I don't think this is them trying to sell their goods. I think Ishikevitz in particular, this guy's a patriot. He's a patriot in the scariest sense of the word, though. I think that in the sense that both patriotism and profit lead to military buildup, but I think patriotism is perhaps more dangerous because it's cloaked in this covering of self-sacrificing devotion to nation, and it becomes harder to critique that. When you say that I'm motivated, I'm giving this technology to defend the rhino because I love the rhino, it's part of my national heritage, it actually becomes harder to critique that than simply saying I want to reap profit off of this. And this is sort of the danger of linking patriotism or nationalism in nature. Again, let's go back to the 1990s, lots of really good literature on this that I think can help us work through this. Of all of these, the one that I find the most horrific is this. This is the question of greenwashing with these military firms. And I think what's going on here is that they are dazzling us with rhino protection. And these videos with the inspirational music and the great things they're doing to save the rhino. But in doing that, they're shifting our attention away from the tanks, aircraft, missiles, bombs, and small arms they produce. They're shifting our attention away from the environmental destruction and the intense human misery that these weapons leave in the wake of conflict around the world. We should be horrified by this because we've exited the realm of conservation now. We're no longer just talking about conservation. We're talking about this massive political economy of violence and the way that conservation is being used as an alibi to sort of defend this economy and more accurately, to shift our attention away from this economy of violence. And that we really, I think, should be horrified and offended by what's going on with greenwashing. I was thinking about this today as I was going through my notes. Sort of, if there's anything that you take away from this talk, this might be it, to sort of reject the greenwashing that's going on. Because again, it's so much bigger than just conservation. Future paths, I'm actually not going to say anything about this. I had a few things to say, but I actually want to hear what you have to say, because I think this really does need to be a conversation amongst us. Okay, so let me wrap up with my conclusion. So let's go back to this sleepless night in Kruger. I lay awake that night absorbing the sounds of hovering helicopters, their blades slicing rhythmically against the full moon. This is the soundscape of capitalism meeting militarized conservation. Listen harder, and you will hear the digital whisper of donations moving swiftly from the bank accounts of philanthro-tourists. Facilitated by luxury tourism outfitters, these funds finance the moving of rhinos from South Africa to Botswana. Botswana, the promised land we shoot on sight, where God is on standby to greet perceived environmental transgressors. These murmurs are joined by mega donations like those from Howard Buffett. Together, these sounds become a chorus, singing the praises of an expanding encounter between conservation, security, and capitalism. Indeed, this chorus enables the encounter. And the outcome is arguably not a safer environment for wildlife, especially in the long run. Rather, the outcome is the vitalization of the state. States are rebuilt with greater military capacity, purpose, urgency, and license to defend wildlife as natural resources and as national resources, and to defend protected areas as state territory. Far from diminishing state power or merely reworking it to facilitate capital accumulation, states are strengthened. They are rebuilt to have an even greater capacity for violence and a greater rationale for unleashing it. This is the consequence of capitalism enabling militarized conservation. Thank you.
Invite Scott Cruden to come up and
Okay, hello. I'm not going to talk for too long, hopefully just for long enough to allow our conference mole, Dan Brockington, to go find himself a rhino horn and transform himself into a hybrid of a mole and a rhino. And I know you're up for the task, Dan. Rhinobot, yeah. Where is Dan? There he is. You better get a horn, Dan. So this is, thank you, Libby. This is a fascinating and highly engaging paper. It's kind of funny because Libby and I both work at, Libby's at York and I'm at the U of T, so we work in the same city, but we got to come all the way over here to talk about Libby's work, but of course that allows us to include all of you in the conversation. This paper is a fascinating exploration of the articulation of capitalism, neoliberalism, or neoliberal capitalism, or maybe just capitalism. Libby's still deciding. There's a couple of side notes in the paper about whether to talk about neoliberalism or not, so that's kind of an insight to it. But the state, the South African military, private military contractors, poachers, private philanthropists, and rhinos in South Africa's Kruger National Park and across the border, where some of them are being relocated to Botswana. These are more or less the actors in the story, and Libby seeks to explore how they articulate with one another. She's interested to narrate processes whereby conservation is tied to and caught up with securitization and militarization. Those are themes that we're familiar with in her work, but also the role of the state, private capital, and private actors coming together in these processes of green militarization, and the ways in which we need to understand the particular coherence or lack of coherence in the ways that the state and capitalism specifically combine, and co-produce, in her words, vitalize one another. Now, in fairness, she really talked about vitalizing the state, but I think one of the things that I'm kind of interested in here too is also the vitalization of capital, of capitalism and capitalist relationships, and I sense you're interested in that too, but it's an avenue that you may or may not explore in this or subsequent papers. Now, I enjoyed reading the paper. I'm out of my depth. I don't academic study, conservation, parks, Africa, or the military. So I'm going to try to confine my comments and questions or suggestions to things that I've spent some time thinking about, namely and variously political economy, capitalism, neoliberalism, and environmentalism, capital, elite performances of green piety, what I would refer to as the political ecology of capitalism and some related matters. And I also want to say that these comments are not by any means directed as critiques of Libby's paper. They're more inspired by it, but meant to contribute to the broader conversations of which we're all part here. So, first, to get it out of the way, if you want my opinion, because you do have this aside or whether to talk about neoliberalism in the paper, I don't think the paper needs to engage with neoliberalism at all. There's already enough of that out there. Libby hedges on this and seems ambivalent. So, in as much as the case is explored in terms of public-private partnerships and coalitions of public and private actors in pursuit of conservation policy objectives, a reference might well note that this institutional form and its rollout is one of the hallmark characteristics of neoliberal social regulation that many scholars have identified. And it's important to remember in this respect that neoliberalism is thus not capitalism per se. It's a set of policy prescriptions and practices, some of which have the effect of expanding the scope of private property rights, private decision-making, commodification, and markets. But I don't think the involvement of elite actors via, for example, private purchase of elite ecotourism junkets and the like are all that productively deployed as neoliberal tendencies. And I'm not saying you say that, but I think sometimes that circulates. But that's, in fact, a much older practice. I think we need to sort of identify and note that, because in some ways it's more neo-colonial than neoliberal. Second, I want to pull out two quotes that for me open up room for discussion about how we conceptualize capitalism, and more precisely capital on the one hand and states on the other. Libby's clearly preoccupied in the paper with exploring both in relational fashion to understand the ways in which private capital and private wealth, and I do want to come back to that distinction because I think it's necessary to make it here, and the relationship between private capital and private wealth with the vitalization of the state. I'm very happy to see that Libby is motivated to transcend tired dichotomies, themselves actually neoliberal tropes, between states and markets, states and capital, private and public. These are deployed in the paper as relational categories, as they should be, and Libby is particularly motivated to see how the state's action is facilitated by private actors operating in and through the state, private actors operating from within the state, and equally how private actors, including some firms and certain kinds of enclosures, that's my term, but I think that could also make it into the paper in its final form, are in turn themselves vitalized by state action. Libby writes, and I quote, "This requires a type of gestalt shift, one in which we focus squarely on the state and see it not merely as the handmaiden of capital. Rather, we need to hold the state and capital in focus simultaneously in our understanding of militarized conservation, especially in this age of conservation security." Second quote, "States are actually built through a range of concrete practices and interests, rather than being pre-existing entities or static containers in which social relations take place," unquote. I agree regarding states in both respects, although I might want to emphasize stability here slightly more than is suggested by a singular focus on the state as an entirely emergent phenomenon, because after all, nation states, both in their particular form and as general institutions, do seem to persist. But my question is, does this not also apply to what we refer to as capitalism? What is the relation between the whole, capitalism, and the discrete processes and practices that constitute it, capital I-T? How can we think about capitalism as being constituted by diverse actors and their practices? That too might be a fruitful line of discussion to develop in parallel in this paper, although it's probably asking too much, so I'm just throwing it out there also for all of us in our work to think about capitalism as not some sort of static singularity with causal properties, but rather a set of practices and processes. And also the need, I think, to distinguish between capitalism as a political economic system, however we might define that, and capital as in private wealth deployed in the form of capital. So to distinguish between capitalism and capital, but also between capital and private money, because private money is not necessarily capital. So this gets into a larger discussion that I hope we all have some stake in, that has to do with our use of abstractions as strategic essentialisms: capital, state, nature. Well, I think it's important and indeed necessary to examine these strategic essentialisms, and these are certainly three of the bigger ones out there: capital, state, nature. We do need to remember that these are strategic essentialisms. They're abstractions, and as such, they do not exist as such. except as such. In this sense, there is no singular capitalism, there is no singular state, there is no singular neoliberalism, there is no singular nature. They're simply processes, they're names we give to processes that we're trying to explain, some of which seem familiar and which therefore cause us to label them as the same thing. But one of the things we have to hold in tension in our work is the degree to which what we see really does exhibit the properties that we associate with such strategic essentialisms, and if not, we need to come up with new strategic essentialisms, new forms of abstraction that help illuminate our observations. Then, of course, one of the ironies here, and I can't help but note this, is that capitalism itself, as Marx brilliantly showed, operates in part on the basis of the domination of abstractions over the concrete. And Neil Smith then used this to point toward the ways in which the capitalist production of nature in some ways is defined by the ideological domination of commodified nature over material nature as we encounter the ideology of the commodity. Now, I'm not going to go on about this except to say that in this particular paper, the articulation of state, capital, nature, I think needs to be explored explicitly in terms of ideology and hegemony. It's not simply the flow of money, the flow of commodities, the institutional relationships, but this is what you're getting at with this greenwashing argument, right? That these acts of philanthropy from military contractors and associated actors, as well as by private donors of all kinds, operate as powerful ideological levers. They force us to explain, for instance, something that they seek to naturalize. Capitalism, capital, wealth, social elites, and of course the military. I mean, the military, of course, are all integral to achieving conservation goals. That is the premise, but it's posed as the conclusion, and what we're trying to do is turn it into a question. This is, I think, what he's trying to do with the paper, among other things. So I invoke this for a couple of reasons. One is because I think I want to suggest caution in moving too quickly to talk of what the state does and what capital does, or how it works as a singular totality, and instead to think at one level of abstraction below this, and to consider how elite actors deploy and seek to expand their power and their control over strategic resources, both material and symbolic, within the sphere of attempts to both commodify and conserve certain kinds of biodiversity. So it seems to me that a focus on elite actors here might help sort of clarify this messy interplay between the state and the sphere of private capital and private wealth. We may be able to move more easily from narratives based on what to narratives and explanations based on who and how. And it would seem in this case that some social elites do indeed wear more than one hat. So the question is, are they to be defined by their hats? I also want to slow down slightly in order to distinguish between money and capital. Not all money is capital, and not all capital is money. Private wealth flowing into biodiversity conservation in various guises, to me, is not the same thing as private capital. Capital, to me, is a very specific form of wealth, one that's deployed in search of expanding itself, and has thus been called capital, a value in motion. It's one of the ways that capital has been defined. Of course, we cannot be too fine, since private wealth may well arise from accumulation elsewhere. As Libby points out in the paper, the demand for rhino horns is coming from the explosion of wealth creation in Asia, largely. But philanthropy and philanthropic flows of money to me are sufficiently distinct from capital investments per se to give me pause and ask where and how is value being created in all of this? Where and how is surplus being extracted and by whom? And how and where is capital actually accumulating as capital does? Likewise, ownership of property may or may not result in the deployment of that property as a species of capital. So we need to remember that capital is also a particular kind of social relation. Perhaps it might be helpful then, and again this is specific to this paper, these other comments are more general in terms of the way we talk about these things, but I wonder whether it might be helpful to deploy language not only of social elites, but also of a diverse economy of biodiversity conservation and poaching. And to think about what's at stake in insisting that these are or are not species of capitalism per se. Libby asks, so where do we locate capitalism? Put simply, although rhino protection is not centrally motivated by capitalist logic, and this is a quote from the paper. So where do we locate capitalism? Put simply, although rhino protection is not centrally motivated by capitalist logic, it is increasingly shaped and enabled by partnerships with for-profit firms and private donors, unquote. Yes, we need to understand the articulation of capitalism and conservation, the state and commodification, but what about poaching? Now, I do want to acknowledge that Libby said, I'm not going to deal with poaching. But I think it's actually really interesting to think about the relationship between capitalism and poaching, because I think it points to something that a lot of folks in this room and our work are grappling with, which is the role of appropriation in capitalist reproduction. or not and how we might conceptualize poaching as a form of capitalism, or perhaps better, how poaching operates in relation to capitalist processes, or what we think we understand as capitalist processes. And here I invoke the spirit of Gibson Graham in the subtitle of their first book referencing capitalism as we knew it. Quite cleverly, I think they provoked us to think carefully about what capitalism is and is not, and how we know it, or think we know it. Do poachers, for instance, have employees? How do they extract surplus? How do we conceptualize the circulation, production, and extraction of value in this context? These are not small matters of conceptual clarification. They go right to the heart of how we understand capitalist accumulation, particularly in relation to processes of appropriation and transformation of the world around us, including the various forms of biodiversity and social nature that animate our working part. Capitalism clearly involves the production of value. We know that. The expansion of value, with value here being narrowly defined as exchange value. I do know about and actually insist on other notions of value, and I realize that's one of the things that brings us together at gatherings like this. But does capitalist production and the reproduction of capitalist social relations and institutions also rely on appropriation rather than on the logic of production? On theft, feminist political economists, political ecologists, ecological Marxists, and others have long insisted the answer is yes. And that means these dynamics are actually internal to capitalism. They're not non-capitalism. If capitalism cannot endure without them, if capitalism is in part reliant on ongoing theft. This talk of appropriation then leads me to suggest working to tease out the essential role that states have played and continue to play in establishing and maintaining exclusive private property claims, formal and informal, mind you, over all matter of the social natures that animate our work. Here I think a silent presence that stalks this paper, but of course it runs through a lot of our work, is the longer history of enclosure in relation to capitalist accumulation. Neoliberalism, of course, is also seen to be defined by a renewed era of appropriations and enclosures, an intensification of that logic. And I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that Marx's conception of primitive accumulation was precisely aimed at critiquing classical political economy and its practitioners for failing to address the role of coercive dispossession and appropriation, essentially theft, in the historical development of capitalism. More recent uses and explorations of this concept by the likes of Silvia Federici and Massimo De Angelis remind us that the concept of primitive accumulation and the various underlying processes to which it refers point to primitive accumulation not as something that happened in the past, but rather as an ongoing and necessary condition for accumulation and the reproduction of capitalist social relations, including not only the private property relation or relations, but also wage relations. As De Angelis put it in a very provocative paper, primitive accumulation is in this sense the ontology of capitalism. So, however, that's another strategic essentialism that needs to be animated by looking in specific geographical space and historical time. When we do, we find that it's not always or even usually the capitalists per se who are doing the enclosing, which I think is one of the things that Libby's pointing to, right? It's actually the state that is doing the enclosing. Now, in this case, enclosure is also something to be sort of grappled with because it seems like it's an incomplete project, and it seems to be one of the things that is at stake here. What is the scale and scope of enclosure? Nor is it always those who do the enclosing who thereby extract the surplus. Things get complicated, as they should. Theory were as complicated as real life. We wouldn't need theory to help make sense of real life, other than, of course, to employ academics. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'm sure that you have all kinds of questions and comments.
Thanks, Libby, for a really provocative talk. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on the relationship between sand parks and other state agencies, because it comes across as if you're holding sand parks synonymous with the state. It comes across as a bit kind of homogenous and absolute. So maybe if you can elaborate, unpack that a bit, help nuance the discussion.
Some more.
Maybe this is just a simplified version of what's taught. I just have two quick questions. One is, this is a wonderful, horrifying case study, and so I'm just curious. One, how different is it from the invention of the park itself. It seems like something very similar to its origins. And does it matter that there's these continuities, militarization, state formation, etc. The second is you want us to leap from the case study to the general, and my jet lag mind didn't help me making that step. So what in Southern Africa looks like this form of militarized anti-culture? Can you just give us some narrative a little bit, leap up from the park? Because you left quite quickly up to the state of the capital. I'm just curious how it influences changes the dynamics beyond the park.
I think two very good questions to maybe get started with, and then we move to a second round after.
I want to just mention a few things to Scott's comments first, is that okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was like absolutely amazing. I wish every review of every paper I got was that helpful. I can't, that'd be selfish on my part, but I obviously can't go through everything, but there's just a few things I wanted to say. I think you're absolutely right about the kind of shift the focus onto capitalism, and this could easily be a story about the co-production of capitalism as well. But just to give you some kind of insight into my motivation here, I actually kind of want to sneakily use this paper to like bring the state back into discussions around capitalism and conservation, because I feel like it's not really there, which is why I want to foreground the state. I mean, I think you're right that there's sort of this strategy and like, let's go back to the 90s. Let's look at, the work of Peter and Nancy and Sivaramakrishnan and James Scott, and I think they have a lot to tell us about the state. And I think there is something about securitization that is bringing the state back in. Like there's something new here. So that kind of explains, I think you're totally right, but I do want to foreground the state. And also to be like, kind of like the confessional here, I'm a bit of a lurker into the literature on capitalism and nature. Like, it's my first attempt to really engage with it. I've been a little bit lazy. So I appreciate the kind of pushing me to be more precise on my language and so forth. That's really useful. But I need to think a lot more, I think, about these relationships. And I think this actually, the point about not kind of homogenizing capital, and I think Wolf's question, it speaks to this, and not homogenizing the state. Like, what is the state? What is capital? And I really like Scott's suggestion here about thinking about actors and elite actors, and kind of who in Sandparks is elite actors. I do have a slippage here where Sandparks becomes the state, which I do think is problematic, and maybe just a little bit more precise language here. And maybe think, and this is always kind of the dilemma too, is even Sandparks isn't a unified actor. Like there's actors in Sandparks that are really horrified by militarized conservation, and they're trying to do what they can to draw kind of attention to some of these problems as well. So I think maybe this is an issue of thinking through some larger theoretical questions, but also just thinking through the precision of language and how we portray this. Okay, very briefly, looking at the Rhino protein economy, yes, and yes, want to do it, we tried to do it, it's too dangerous to do. Can't do it right now, it really is too dangerous. Especially looking at what's going on the ground. Francis and Rebecca and I were just in Mozambique for, a few days before we came here and really trying to unravel this. One of our colleagues had a tire slash last year. Can't do it right now. And I think I want to be careful. I think you're absolutely right, and this might be my question too about the sort of historical precedent, like what's the link between the creation of Kruger and these processes that we're seeing now. I do think we need to go there, but we need to go there in a way that's careful not to romanticize the poacher. I really worry about this, that it's not the noble poacher who's there to kind of take back what is rightfully his. Poaching is an extraordinarily violent economy, and I think to reduce it, and not that anyone is suggesting that, but just to kind of preempt that, because I have that urge, like I want to do that, and so you kind of go there and see the violence of the poaching economy itself on communities, just sort of, I guess, a note of caution to myself, if not anyone else. Okay, how is this different from the invention of the park itself? I mean, I think there's repetitions here, and I think Scott's right that this is about enclosure, and it's kind of the legacy of enclosure. And we actually do see evidence of some poachers. This isn't from my work, this is from work from some colleagues actually interviewed in prison who have explained that they're pissed off about the park. The park has taken their land away. And on the Mozambican side of the border, the park is still taking their land away, and this motivates them, I think, tied up with this history of colonialism, to take back what is rightfully theirs. So I think there's historical repetition there, but there's also some salient differences. I think one of the reasons communities were initially kicked out of Kruger was to create labor available for the state. And you kick people off their land, they're no longer able to farm, and they are forced into wage labor. And that's something I think that's very different than what we're seeing today. The labor relations are quite different. But still there is this ongoing sense of dispossession that, you know, there's still land claims in Kruger today. Maybe I'll open it up to other questions, if that's okay, or?
Well, one question about moving to a more general.
Oh, okay.
I think that one is quite important.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't. That's actually an important part of this talk. So I do hope it's your jet lag, and I hope it's not my inadequacies as a scholar. But the point about going from the specific to the general, I think the point about the private military corporations is that this, like I said, this is the tip of the iceberg. Like, and I know Rosalind sees this more, she's in East Africa as well, as these private security firms. In my case, military and defense corporations getting involved in conservation. And it's kind of thinking about their rationales, that this is about maximizing profit, about rehabilitating reputations and so forth. It's sort of a sense of what we need to watch out for, that this isn't just in South Africa that we're seeing this, we're really seeing this around other parts of Africa as well, perhaps globally. I'd be interested to hear from the rest of you about that. And the case about rhino relocation was really a case of not rhino relocation itself, but taking a case that on the surface seems like it doesn't have anything to do with militarized conservation, but to show that in a case like this, that militarized conservation seeps into it. And to pay attention to these cases that I think I want to be behind, I want to support, but because there's this logic that poaching is a security issue and needs to be responded to as such, that we're seeing militarized conservation sneak into these other projects as a sort of legitimate response to rhino poaching. So to pay attention to this sort of its insidious nature. It's not just about the spectacular, it's not just about the Gazelle military tactical helicopter and the contributions of Paramount, it's about these more subtle projects like rhino relocation. Does that help?
I'm quite conscious of time. We have already moved a little bit beyond sort of the allotted schedule. So if you allow me, I want to ask if there are any other direct questions, maybe to either Libby and or Scott. If you approach them afterwards. I'm also very aware that it's Saturday. It's been 3 very intensive days. We still have sort of a final thing. It's not going to take a whole hour, so you don't have to worry about that at all. So if you will then join me in thanking the 2 speakers very much.